Newton was born. That would be an example. Mathematicians are trying to solve problems, but the problems they try to solve pre-existed the mathematicians. They were there all the time. Mathematicians are only trying to operate with them, to think about them.
Robert, are you saying that the phenomena, what's the singular?
Phenomenon.
Phenomenon was there all the time. Not that the thought was there all the time. That is, the experience of gravity was there, pre-existed the conception of gravity.
Yes.
Is that what you're saying? Or are you saying the thought of the...
Bion calls that thought without a thinker.
Got it. Okay. I get
Right?
that. Sure.
That's
fine.
Yeah, I mean, it's a way to turn the paradigm upside down, right? But why? Because one could wrongly say, and most people would agree with this falsity, right, that Newton created the thought of the law of gravity, rather than saying Newton discovered it.
Yeah, it's like Piaget's stages, the same thing, you know, that the infant doesn't understand about law of transitivity, say. Is that Piaget?
Might be.
Yeah, I think.
Yes. Yes.
Before he or she comes into that cognitive development, so that there was a thought without a thinker about that principle that the mind couldn't experience, couldn't realize, couldn't conceive of before it had the, I don't know how you can say it, but I think I understand. It's like there are things that need a receptive mind to experience that are always there. That, you know, talking about child development messes it up a little bit. I think gravity is cleaner.
No, it is not. It also develops. When we say that a child has a delayed development because he hasn't been stimulated enough, right? The concept we have is the Bionian concept of thoughts developing the mind and not the mind developing the thoughts, right? That is, that a child that is presented with problems that we call stimuli, you give the child a toy and you see what it does with the toy. Now this toy is a stimulus for the child to operate with it, to see what it can do with it, to explore it. But the toy is there all along. Think of the thoughts without a thinker as the toys that you give the child to stimulate the child's curiosity, the child trying to discover it, to make something with it. That's stimulation. When we send children to kindergarten, we hope that kindergarten will stimulate the child's wish to think, to know, to understand, and so on.
With the parent,
the grid is stimulation.
Pardon me?
The grid is stimulation.
Well, it is, and here it goes, right? Now, you were about to say
well,
something.
Not to leave that thought, because the parents that put the toys there, I think part of the problem with the use of thought is he's turned it around, like you say. We think our thinking makes thoughts, but the thought is there in the universe.
Exactly.
I'm wondering if this relates to like the Godhead idea. I mean, is it God's thought that we're just discovering, and there's really no, creativity that we're doing? We're just unwinding or discovering what's already there.
That's well said. Yes. Right. Yes.
And this also seems to be related to the ideas that Plato had, the Platonic ideas that there is a true chair somewhere. It's a ideal.
Yes.
Is that related to this?
The Platonic forms,
ideals,
you mean?
forms,
I think so, yes.
Forms,
I think, yes. I don't know enough about philosophy, so I can't very well operate with that. But I know that Blandonu mentions Plato, and I think Bion at some point does too. Yes. Right?
Would this also be related to Jung's archetypes?
Blandonu speaks about that in the chapter, doesn't he? He talks about both Lacan and Jung, doesn't he? He speaks of the big other of Lacan and the archetypes of Jung, yes. right? But let us go back a minute to the grid in the few minutes we have. So this grid it has some similarity to Mendeleev's periodic table. If you study chemistry in high school or in college, you probably remember the periodic table of the chemist, Russian chemist Mendeleev, who classified in his periodic table the different elements in the world, right? According to their valencies and their atomic weights. So much so that he was left with some empty boxes of elements that had not yet been identified, and he said, according to my table, there must, here in this blank space, there must be an element yet to be discovered, here another and here another. And so far, several of the elements that Mendeleev had calculated and were not discovered, finally were found thanks to his periodic table, right? Now, this is in some way following the same logic, the periodic table where something grows and changes. So the idea that each of these, let's say, columns and rows contain letters and numbers indicates they both on the horizontal axis the use to which thoughts can be put to, while in the vertical column it's the degree of sophistication that Bion also calls abstraction that they acquire. On the upper left corner, I mean, one would have to see a gradient between the upper left corner and the bottom right corner, right? This is the way, I mean, this diagonal will show a progression in the uses and the sophistication of the thoughts. The further down, the more abstract, but also the more abstract, they are more general, and therefore do say less about the specifics. For instance, you could say that saying that the Oedipal conflict is an element or is a factor in our personality is a statement that you could classify probably somewhere in F1. It's a definitory hypothesis that is generally true, but it's so general that it doesn't say anything about the shape that in a particular individual the Oedipus complex will take. It's when we say Oedipus complex, we don't mean to say that we have the story of Oedipus with Mr. Oedipus in our minds and with Laius and Tiresias and all that. We mean that there is something in our unconscious that follows a pattern similar to the kind of relations of the myth or the story of Oedipus, but we don't mean that it's exactly that story, right? So saying that everyone has an Oedipus conflict is right, but it's very abstract, and as an abstraction it's very general, it applies to each one of us. It doesn't help us in the clinical hour to say to a patient you have an Oedipal complex, because the patient would say, oh yes, well that's interesting. And so what? It wouldn't make any change, would it? If we were to make any change, we have to operate a little higher up in the grid to identify what is it in the personality or in the conscious of the patient, in this particular patient, what is his narrative, his individual idiosyncratic narrative that has some similarity to the myth of Oedipus or to any other myth. right? A myth instead, row C, dreams, dream thoughts and myth, right? A myth is a narrative, right? For instance, the Oedipus myth is a story, and a patient can bring in a similar story that he made up. When I say he made up, I don't say that this is a lie. I just say this is his story. This is the way he put together his elements, right? If a patient comes in, for instance, and says, well, I was really very unfortunate. I had a very bad relation to my father, and actually my mother died, and my father married another woman who became my stepmother, who didn't want me, and so my father gave me away to an uncle, and this made me feel terribly bad. Well, you can recognize there some elements that sound a bit like the Oedipus myth, right? I mean, this is this father that didn't want the baby, gave the baby away, then the baby was left without the father on the top of the mountain. In this case, the top of the mountain is the uncle, but you can recognize some of the elements. Or the patient may have a dream, right? Most of the patients, most of us do dream. Well, a dream is a private myth, Bion says. That is your private myth. In that sense, when a patient tells us a dream, we can make more of that than if a patient were to say, I have an Oedipal conflict, right? Mirta once had a patient back in Buenos Aires, a young boy who came and said, I have in Spanish, Edipo and Ipo sound very similar. Ipo means hiccups, and the patient didn't understand or misunderstood, must have heard, Edipo and Ipo, and says, I have a hiccup complex, meaning an Oedipus complex. But of course, he didn't know what the Oedipus complex meant. He had only heard that we all had Oedipus complexes. Well, the therapist couldn't get any wiser from hearing that the patient said that I have an Oedipus complex. But if the patient brings in a dream, that's a different story, because that dream is his dream. It's not an abstract theory or an abstract concept that you would put in row F, 1F. It's his story, his particular story, that shows up in the form of a dream or in the form of a myth or in the form of whatever story the patient tells you of. And that does shed some light about the mind of the patient. Now, why are in row A we find beta elements, and certainly beta elements are just definitive hypothesis, could also be used to form, let's say, a beta screen, right? An attempt to refuse knowledge, to not know anything. Remember that column 2, right, is resistance, right? Resistance to know.
Row A, column 2.
Column 2.
So A2.
No, all column 2 is resistance.
Oh, this is resistance.
I thought it was countertransference.
I thought it was unsaturated.
No, that is Xi. That is Xi.
Oh,
This is C, right?
This is
C.
Psi, right.
C,
Greek
which is
letters.
this one here.
Right.
So what is that?
That stands for false statements.
False
Statements
statement,
known to be false.
So resistance.
that's the sign there on the 2.
Yes, exactly. Right? But a lie, for instance, would be classified in column 2. A projective identification for the purpose of defense would be classified in column 2, right?
Maybe a delusion.
A delusion would be part of column 2, absolutely, yes. Right? Now, beta elements cannot be used for any other thing except for action. You can evacuate, right, beta elements through action. You get angry, you punch someone in the stomach. Well, that is really causing someone pain, physical pain, through action, right? Or you have a seizure, right? Or you say fuck, 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 meaning just right? I make this awful noise, I don't